Most management problems don't get solved. They get managed. They get worked around. They get lived with. Or they get handed upward to someone with a bigger title and the same toolkit. And if you ask most middle managers why that is, you'll get answers about resources or politics or the pace of the business. Occasionally, if you push, you'll get something about team capability. What you almost never get is the real answer. The problem didn't get solved because it was never actually defined. What was defined confidently, quickly, and often incorrectly was the symptom, the visible surface of something deeper. And once you've defined the wrong problem, everything that follows is a very efficient journey in the wrong direction. This is what I call the definition trap. And in over 20 years of working with managers across organizations of every size, it's one of the most consistent and costly mistakes I've seen at every level of the management organization. In this episode, I want to do three things. First, I'm going to show you what the trap actually looks like from the inside, because it's nearly invisible when you're in it. Second, I'm going to name the most common ways managers fall into it. And third, I'm going to give you three specific techniques for framing problems properly before you waste your time solving the wrong one. My name is Marcel. I'm a chartered manager with over 2 decades of experience working across different size organizations, from small companies to global corporations. And one of the things they all have in common is this: the managers who progress furthest are not always the ones who solve problems fastest. They're the ones who understand what they're actually dealing with. Let me give you a scenario. Sarah is a middle manager in a professional services firm. She's smart, experienced, well regarded. Her team has been missing project deadlines for the past quarter. Not badly, but consistently. A day here, 2 days there. Enough that clients have started to notice. Enough that Sarah's director has started asking questions. Now, Sarah looks at the data, she reviews the project, she talks to her team leads, and she lands on a diagnostic. The team isn't planning effectively. There's not enough rigor in how they scope work at the start of the project, so she introduces a new planning template. She runs a training session on project estimation. She implements a weekly review process. 3 months later, the deadlines are still slipping. What happened? Sarah solved the problem she could see. The planning process was genuinely weak. She wasn't wrong about that. But the planning process was a symptom. The actual problem, which the new template couldn't touch, was that 2 of her most experienced people were quietly burning out. They'd been over-allocated for the better part of a year. They were too professional to say so, too committed to raise a flag, and too exhausted to plan well, even when they were given tools to do so. Better planning templates don't fix exhausted people. The problem Sarah solved was real. It just wasn't the right problem. And this is how the definition trap works. It doesn't feel like a trap. It feels like competent, responsive management. You see an issue, you move towards it, you diagnose it, you act. Everything about that sequence feels right. The urgency is real, the intent is genuine, and the effort is substantial. Now, what's missing is the pause between observation and conclusion. The pause that asks, am I looking at the problem or at the most visible expression of it? Before we get to the techniques, I want to name the 3 most common versions of the definition trap that I see in middle management, because recognizing the pattern you're in is the first step to getting out of it. Trap number 1 is the presenting problem. This is what Sarah fell into. Someone brings you a problem, or a problem becomes visible, and you treat a presenting version of it as the real version of it. The presenting problem is what showed up, and it's rarely the whole story. Deadline slipping is a presenting problem. Client complaints are a presenting problem. Team conflicts, high attrition, underperformance in a specific individual, all presenting. They are real, they need addressing, but they are pointing to something, not describing it. The question that gets you past the presenting problem is simple. If this symptom disappeared tomorrow, would the underlying issue still be there? Now, if the answer is yes, and it usually is, you haven't found the problem yet. Trap number 2, the familiar problem. This one is subtler. and in some ways more dangerous because it's driven by genuine expertise. When you've been managing long enough, you start to develop pattern recognition. You've seen certain types of problems before. You know what they look like. And when something arrives on your desk that resembles a pattern you recognize, the brain does something efficient and unhelpful. It assigns the familiar label before the investigation is complete. Now, this looks like a communication issue. This is a capability gap. This is what happens when people don't have clear KPIs. Maybe. Or maybe it looks like those things because they are categories you've trained yourself to see. The familiar problem trap produces confident misdiagnosis. The manager isn't being careless. They're being experienced. But the experience applied without fresh examination is just assumption dressed in credibility. The tell is speed. If you found yourself knowing exactly what the problem was before you finished listening, that's a signal to slow down. Trap number 3 is the convenient problem. This is one that nobody talks about, and it's the most political of the 3. Sometimes the problem that gets defined is the problem that's safe to define. The problem that doesn't implicate the wrong person, doesn't require an uncomfortable conversation, doesn't create friction with a peer or upward relationship. The real problem might be in a function you don't own. It might be a consequence of a decision made 2 levels above you. It might involve someone politically connected or just difficult to challenge. So the problem gets redefined, unconsciously or deliberately, as something within your sphere of influence. That's something that you can act on. Something that doesn't require you to carry a message that might come back on you. The result is competent action on a safe target. The underlying issue remains untouched. I'm not making a moral argument here. I'm making a strategic one. Managers who develop a reputation for solving the convenient problem tend to plateau quite quickly. Those who are known for finding the actual problem and naming it clearly with evidence, regardless of where it sits, tend to progress. Because that's what organizations value at senior levels. Not comfort, but clarity. So, now that we know what we're dealing with, let's build something useful. I've chosen 3 techniques that I've seen work consistently across different types of management problems. They're not complicated, but they require something that is genuinely hard for action-oriented managers. The willingness to stay in the question a little longer before reaching for the answer. Technique number 1, the 5 whys. This one's been around for decades. It originated in the Toyota production system, and it remains one of the most useful tools in a manager's diagnostic kit, precisely because of its simplicity. The principle is this: when a problem presents itself, you ask why it's happening, and then you take the answer to that question and ask why again. You repeat this 5 times, or as many times as it takes to reach something that feels like a root cause rather than a symptom. Okay, let's go back to Sarah's scenario. Deadlines are slipping. Why? Well, because the planning at the start of projects is inaccurate. Why? Because the estimates don't account for the actual workload each person is carrying. Why? Because no one has a clear picture of total allocation across the team. Why? Because we don't have a resource tracking process. Why? Because when we were a smaller team, it wasn't needed, and we never built one as we grew. Now we're somewhat interesting. The problem is not weak planning. The problem is a resourcing infrastructure that didn't scale with the team. And that's a different conversation with different stakeholders, completely different solutions, and a different timeline. One important note on this 5 whys: it works better as a conversation, not a solo exercise. When you run it with the people closest to the problem, your team leads, your direct reports, occasionally the person experiencing the issue, you get answers that your own assumptions would never surface. Now, this technique doesn't require expertise. It requires patience and willingness to be surprised by what you find. Technique 2, the problem inversion. This one is well less known and has become one of my favorite. The standard approach to the problem framing is to ask, what is going wrong and why? The problem inversion flips it. Instead of asking what's causing the problem, you ask what would need to be true for this problem not to exist. Now, it sounds simple. The effect it has on the diagnostic process is substantial. When you ask what would need to be true for the deadlines not to slip, you get a very different set of answers than when you ask why the deadlines are slipping. You start thinking about conditions rather than causes. You start imagining the system you'd need rather than analyzing the system you have. Now, in Sarah's case, the answers might include people would need to know the true capacity before committing to timelines. Project leads would need a shared view of teams' allocations. There would need to be a normalized process for flagging overload early. None of these answers came from the original question. They came from the inverted one. The reason this technique works is psychological as much as analytical. Deficit thinking, what's wrong, activates a diagnostic fault-finding mode, where inversion thinking, what would right look like, activates a design mode. You're no longer examining a broken system, you're sketching a functional one. And that shift changes what you're able to achieve. I use this technique most often when the 5 whys have stalled. When the answer keeps looping back to the same surface causes, inversion cuts through that loop. Technique number 3, the stakeholder lens test. The first 2 techniques are primarily analytical. This one is relational and it addresses something the others 2 can miss. Most problems in organizations are not purely technical, they exist at the intersection of systemic, people and interests, which means that how a problem is defined often depends on where you're standing when you look at it. The stakeholder lens test asks you to deliberately step into perspective of each significant stakeholder before you finalize your problem definition. In Sarah's case, the stakeholders include her team, who are burning out, the project leads, who are being held accountable for timelines they can't control, the client, obviously, who care about delivery reliability, and Sarah's director, who is managing reputational risk with those customers. When Sarah frames the problem only from her own vantage point, she sees a planning issue. When she frames it from her team's perspective, she sees an allocation and well-being issue. And when she frames it from director's perspective, she sees a client confidence issue that is downstream of an operational one. These aren't competing definitions, they're different facets of the same problem. The value of the stakeholder lens test is that it forces you to hold all of them before deciding which to prioritize, and crucially, which to address first in order to create the conditions for addressing the others. The practical version of this technique is straightforward. Before you finalize a problem statement, write it out from the perspective of each key stakeholder. I mean, literally, rewrite it in their voice as they would describe it. Then look at what the different versions have in common. The intersection is usually where the real problem lives. These 3 techniques all point toward the same output: a properly framed problem statement. This is something most managers never write. They carry a version of the problem in their head, often the presenting version shaped by the first person who described it to them, and they manage from that internal definition without ever testing it. A written problem statement forces precision, and precision, at least in my experience, is where most of the diagnostic work actually happens. A properly framed problem statement has 4 elements. First, what is actually happening, described in observable terms, not interpretation, not causes, what can be observed and measured. Second is what the impact is and on whom. Not just that something is going wrong, but specifically who is experiencing it and what it's costing them. 3, what is not the problem? What is the element most people skip and it's the most valuable? Explicitly excluding the things that look like the problem but aren't the problem. Forces you have to defend your definition. If you can't articulate what the problem isn't, you probably don't know precisely what it is. And the 4th one is what the resolved state looks like, not the solution, the condition. What would be true if this problem were no longer a problem? And write that down before you act. Show it to someone who will push back. Sit with it for 24 hours if the timeline allows. The problem that persists longest in organizations are almost always the ones that were never properly defined in the first place. Let me bring this back to where we started, okay? If you're a middle manager, With your eye on a senior leadership role, the transition you're working toward is not just one of responsibility, it's one of perception. Senior leaders aren't paid to execute well, they're paid to see clearly. Seeing clearly starts with how you define what you're looking at. The manager who walks into a room with a well-framed problem, who can say with precision what is happening, what it's costing, what it isn't, and what resolved looks like, is not just better at the job. They're demonstrating something that is rare and really visible, the ability to operate on the system rather than inside it. That's not a skill you can fake, but it's one that you can build. The definition trap is waiting for you every single time something goes wrong. The presenting problem will show up first. The familiar pattern will feel like recognition. The convenient definition will feel like pragmatism. What separates the managers who move forward from the ones who stay where they are, it's not that they never fall into those traps, it's that they've learned to notice when they have. 5 whys, problem inversion, the stakeholder lens test. Use them, not because they're clever, because they are. Use them because the alternative, solving the wrong problem with great efficiency, is one of the most expensive habits a manager can have. I hope that helped. I'll see you in the next one.